Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Radical Book Fair. It's nice to see a few of you who've been here through the day. We are here to talk about owning the future. My name is Mari. I run the Lighthouse Bookshop, and I'm usually behind the scenes and not on the stage. But I am absolutely thrilled to be here for this particular discussion. This panel, as you may have noticed, has had many permutations, and we're sad not to have Miriam Brett with us today, but we have two wildly different and terrific perspectives on this very important question. So what we are going to do is sort of unpick how the trappings of late capitalism, or neoliberalism as it exists in the world, have taken ownership of our lives, and then how we fight back. And to explore that, we have, first of all, on the end of the sofa, Jeremy Gilbert, who is a professor of cultural and political theory at the University of East London. He's the author of Common Ground, Democracy and Collectivity in the Age of Individualism, Anti-Capitalism and Culture, Radical Theory and Popular Politics, and 21st Century Socialism. He writes regularly in the British press and is the current editor of the journal New Formations, and hosts 3 regular podcasts, hashtag ACFM on Novara Media, Love is the Message, Culture, Power and Politics, and he is the co-author, so I juggle this, of the very brilliant Hegemony Now, How Big Tech and Wall Street Won the World, and crucially, how we win it back. Will you join me in welcoming Jeremy Gilbert? And also with me, we have Mim Skinner, who is a writer and author of Jailbirds, or The Prison Teacher, as well as the newly released Living Together, Searching for Community in a Fractured World. She is also a women's support worker working in communities in the Northeast, and co-funded, how would you say that, Refuse?
We still don't know. It's refuse, one of the 3.
Which is a social enterprise which each week redistributes over a ton of food that would otherwise go to waste. She also runs the Women's Project for Handcrafted, providing at-risk women with housing as well as mental health and addiction support creativity. Will you join me in welcoming him? So, as I mentioned, these are wildly different books, and our speakers are sort of offering insights into this idea of how we take ownership, this situation we're in today, how we build a future, how we've ended up, essentially, in a mess that we feel is the mess we're in today. And we know instinctively things are, or some of us know instinctively, things are not going right. And what do we do with that? And although we have sort of a very rich political theory in Jeremy's book, and Mim's book takes a more sort of journalistic approach, there are common threads that run through both books that are really fascinating in the way that you each approach them. So I just want to start out by asking you each to give our audience a wee overview of the book and the topics that it's exploring and how you're coming at this topic. Who wants to go first? Go for it, Mim.
Go for it, I will, yeah. So it's interesting thinking a lot about system change today, because I guess what I've written about more in Living Together are people who come at the problem the system is broken by saying, okay, well, let's opt out in some way. Let's use critical mass to kind of pilot something different. Let's set up a slightly alternative thing on the side. We live in a community farm in County Durham. I've lived in intentional communities throughout my 20s as well, kind of, yeah, really different ones now as a family to when I was in my 20s, sharing bunk beds and having emergency accommodation, asylum seekers, people who are street homeless in our spare room. And as we grew up and had these other pressures come to join it, you know, whether that's full-time work or, you know, wanting to buy a house or having a child, that life didn't fit anymore. it felt chaotic. It felt, it didn't suit what we needed. And so we moved into a really conventional setup. And over the last kind of year, 2 years, we've been thinking, what does it look like to live, that we can build in micro that world we want to see, but as people with family responsibilities and who married and have a job as well. And so we moved into this community farm, and over the last year I've been touring around the UK and Europe and visiting other people who have decided to kind of live in alternative ways, pilot something new. Housing isn't working for people. The way we build communities isn't for working for lots of people. Levels of mental health epidemics of loneliness are absolutely widespread. So who is doing something different? So I started off with a community called the Bruderhof, who are kind of a Mennonite community similar to the Amish, who have one common purse with 6,000 people, and finished off at Britain's last remaining naturist community, who've built a world which is, entirely clothes optional. And I guess I was just on that journey saying, what are people doing? What are people doing to opt out? What are they doing to find alternatives? The fact that what we have now isn't working for people, that's not a secret. And I think from the top to the bottom, to the left to the right, that's obvious. So I guess the book is finding people who are doing something different and asking them what it is and how they got there.
Brilliant, thank you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks. So, the book is called Hegemony Now, and it is, firstly, it's an intervention into theoretical debate over the idea of hegemony. And hegemony is a term which gets used in various different ways in different fields, but in political theory and in and in the discourse of the broader left, the term is referring to the ways in which particular social groups at any given time can take on a position of leadership, really, in an overall social formation, an overall society. So, and by leadership, what we mean is the capacity to determine the general direction of travel. So, I mean, there's a sort of school undergraduate textbook version of hegemony, which basically says what it means is it's sort of acquiring a position of overall power and dominance in a society. There's a slightly glossed version of that which tends to assume that what it means is somehow convincing large numbers of people that you are the people who ought to be running that society. And really conceptually what the book is trying to do is to sort of complexify that and to some extent take the concept back to its roots in historical materialism. And I would say to sort of illustrate by way of example, I suppose, the situation that Mim was describing is one that I think is familiar to all of us, and it's the outcome of a situation whereby over the past few decades, a very particular mode of life has been presented to us as the one which is normative, is the one that you can be expected to aspire to, and is also the one you can probably have as long as you conform to certain sets of expectations. And it's a way of life which fundamentally revolves around a particular idea of how households should be organised, and it revolves around certain forms of property ownership. And the sort of political intellectual tradition that I come out of, which is sort of Marxist and post-Marxist theory and cultural studies, over the past few decades, it's tended to be mainly interested in the ways in which that people get brought into going along with this kind of way of life by sort of ideological means, by discursive means. So you would look at the way in which we're constantly encouraged to fetishize home ownership. We're constantly, you would look at the ideological work that's been done actually since the 70s to really sort of denigrate the idea of any sort of alternative households. And we think of that's very important, but we think broadly speaking, we think that at least the kind of theoretical traditions that we come out of have kind of gone a bit too far towards this quite this emphasis on the discursive, the ideological, and we think it's really important to focus attention on the fact that, well, I mean, on a fundamental level, what's happened is the labour market and the property markets in particular have been deliberately engineered such that it really is the case that for most people it's extremely difficult to live any other kind of way than to live in a way which is organised around, becoming indebted with a mortgage, B, then having to determine most of your life choices around the need to pay the mortgage, and participating in a particular kind of life which revolves around the nuclear family in the mortgaged household, and it's focusing to some extent on the extent to which, on the one hand, that has meant really. What's important to understand is the extent to which that situation has been material engineered. It's not just that people are sort of deluded. It's not that people can't. I think it's not actually that people can't conceive of some other way of life. It's that people are quite conscious that any other way of life is very, very difficult if you don't have access to independent wealth and resources, actually. And so, at a broader level, what that kind of analysis has involved has been us looking at the question of, well, who are the social groups that have really benefited in what ways by the historical process which has led us to the current situation. And in really crude terms, in global terms, because we sort of, our perspective is sort of transatlantic, it's sort of global, and it's sort of Anglo-American. And in global terms, I mean, our answer to the crude question of, well, who has won out of all this? Who won the 20th century, as we put it, is that it's the most powerful sections of the capitalist class. The most powerful sections of the capitalist class, meaning basically the finance sector and the tech sector. They're the people who've really had the capacity to determine the direction of travel of our culture, of our everyday lives, of our polities. They're the people the programs implemented by almost every government, whatever their supposed political orientation, has benefited, despite the fact that, for the most part, if you look at opinion polls going back to the mid-80s, much of those political programs haven't been very popular. They haven't been what people thought they wanted. I think this, with reference to what Mim was talking about, and actually the first talk we did about the book in Liverpool a few months ago, somebody asked me, they said, how would the analysis be different if it was focused more exclusively on the UK? And I said, well, if we'd focused more exclusively on the UK, the answer to the question would have been slightly different. The answer to the question, who won the 20th century, who is now the hegemonic group around whom everything is organised, in whose interest everything is now organised, it wouldn't be Silicon Valley, it would include the City of London, but more than anything, it would be landlords, essentially. Landlords are the people who won the 20th century in this country. And in Edinburgh as much as anywhere else, frankly. And to the extent that you are able to become a landlord, you can get a piece of that, even if you're only your own landlord, by getting a mortgage. To the extent that you can do that, you can get a piece of that. To the extent that you are not able to be a landlord, or even your own landlord, you're going to be excluded from that. You're not going to be able to sort of have the kind of life that you want. And why this is all really important, sort of politically, is I think this has to be the starting point for any attempt to change any of this stuff. Any attempt to change any of this has to start from the recognition. Firstly, it's true. It's absolutely true in Britain. The major factor. This is less true in Scotland than it is in England and Wales. But for now, that still affects everybody here, unfortunately. But the major determining of voting intentions is whether or not you've got a mortgage and whether or not you've paid it off. Basically, if you've got a mortgage, you're more likely to vote to the right, and if you've paid it off, the chances of you not doing are negligible, unfortunately. And I think similarly that doesn't provide an immediate prescription for what we do about it, because it does put us in a difficult position. I mean, one of the difficulties for progressive forces in Britain is most adults are homeowners. I mean, I know there's a sort of mythology now which sort of overlooks that, but that's true. But that is the basis on which but you have to take account of that if you're going to formulate effective strategies to challenge it. You have to take account of the fact that people have been given this very real material stake in this system, and they're going to have to be given some kind of material motivation in some sense if they're not going to participate in that. You've got to talk to people about exactly what it is that's going to be done for them, about what, and I certainly think that in the past few years, I think that the left, when it's been in positions of, when it's been in the position of having a kind of significant platform in Britain, has really failed to take advantage of that to a large extent. One of the examples I keep using, and I keep saying I'm going to stop using it, but it's appropriate to this conversation, is, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, when he was asked about housing, the first thing he would always talk about was the fact that it's the moral scandal of homelessness in British cities, which is true. It's true that it's a problem, and it's true that it's a moral scandal, but that's also, from our point of view, missing a crucial opportunity, and it's the opportunity to say to people who are not homeless and don't see themselves as sharing common interest, really, with people who are homeless and who are not motivated by primarily moral considerations, saying to them, look, the reason your kids can't get a house, which is a situation millions of people find themselves in, the reason they can't get a house is because developers and banks have got all the houses, and they're making all the money from them. That's the reason. That's not something Jeremy ever said, like in interviews. He never made that point. And one of our basic arguments in the book is, well, that is the kind of argument that needs to be made if you're going to win people over to a progressive project. If you're going to win people over to a progressive project, you have to be able to talk to the people who are not already thinking of themselves as committed to that project, and you've got to tell them what you're going to do for them, and you've got to tell them who are the people you're going to, challenge on their behalf. So I think that's probably enough as a summary.
So got us started, and I think it gives you a sense of sort of the scope of the book, and you've also sort of whizzed us through the sort of three parts, and in terms of a book that is political theory, it was really refreshing, that third part. What do we do with this information was refreshing. And I want to take us back to the beginning, because one of the things that I found interesting in both of your books that felt very necessary, and it was interesting, the parallels that you came to in quite different ways, was both the need to explain how we got here and what the mess of here is. And you've touched on that a little bit, Jeremy. I wonder if I can bounce to you, Mim, to maybe talk about what is the crisis that you saw as evident when you were traveling around the country and meeting people, and how did it seem like people had got there, or what was in that opening gambit in the book?
Yeah, so there's a kind of few things that lots of these communities are seeking to address. One is a crisis around well-being, and particularly the work-life balance. I looked at my generation. We are called the burnout generation because people are working longer and longer hours to kind of afford the things they need and to seek experiences that justify those hours. People are really exhausted. And the time there is squeezed out. There's lots of interesting research on why people know their neighbours less than they did. The Big Lunch did a piece of research a few years ago, and 76 people felt more distant to those living around them than 20 years ago. And the biggest reason given for that is that people didn't have time. Again, really unsurprising. The kind of other big thing, obviously, is an environmental crisis, excessive individualism, excessive private assets. Those things are fantastic for the market. If we all consume as little pockets of one, they are terrible for the environment if we all consume in pockets of one. At some point, i.e. a while ago, the more important metric of those is the environment. That is a short-term problem. And yeah, I guess the third thing really is around division, and division between peoples and division within communities, there's a kind of interesting thing that happens with technology, which can be for better or worse, where we're able to form these communities of similarity. And if you were the only person in your community who was trans, or who wanted to do climate activism, or was passionate about a particular issue, now more than ever, you can find other people who are your tribe and say, you know, I'm not on my own in this, let's campaign together. That has done wonders for movements around the world. But actually, we do not have endless energy, and the more we connect in groups of like-minded people, there's a kind of deficit of connection on the doorstep, the deficit of the doorstep. And that is where there's difference and where there's disagreement. And I think we talk about kind of these very loaded terms like culture wars or kind of societal division. But what is true, I think, is we're less good at dialogue now, and we're less good at dialogue around difference, and we're more pocketed. The kind of difference of the doorstep, I mean, comparatively, because obviously there's geographic groupings as well, but it does mean that we have to work harder to understand people we disagree with and who disagree with us. And that does really interesting things to how we see each other. Someone can be other until you really, number one, encounter them, but number two, have a stake in the same thing, right? Like, it's very difficult to see somebody as the opposite, the enemy, the other, if you are both, you know, sharing a set of tools or a common garden, or you have a stake in each other's flourishing and well-being. That kind of changes the terms of how we relate to one another. There's lots of kind of things going on there. Environmental crisis, housing crisis. It's also the truth that our generation, many people don't own houses, and their parents do own houses. Those houses aren't disappearing. They didn't stop existing. They are being owned by other people, and that generation is renting. Again, it was interesting for Jeremy to kind of bring that up as well, that there is a crisis in belonging. It is meaningful to people to have a stake in things. As much as we want to say, like, you know, ownership is this kind of, you know, mythic, theoretical thing, well, no, it isn't. It's important to people. And whatever system made that happen, owning houses and owning a stake in a place, in a locality, that is important to people. And what does it mean for all of our kind of sense of connectedness, sense of belonging, sense of this place matters, so let's invest in it, if you can't afford your stake? So those are the kind of the questions I was asking. That's a lot of things. I've basically just said, there's a lot of mess going on. Let's see who's trying to sort out the mess. It's going on in lots of different sectors. But yeah, those were the kind of the main things. And the communities I visited reflected that. Some of them are off-grid communities, environmentalist communities. Some of them look at how we can create homes where people who are disabled and learning disabled are able to live as easily as people who aren't. Some of them, those were in Edinburgh, some of them were communities who said, do you know, it's really lonely living in cities, or we do not need this much private asset. What if we created some frameworks? So there's loads of different, and again, queer communities who felt that they didn't have a place where they could be freely themselves, and so, you know, built a world where they could. So all the problems, some different solutions is the headline.
Thank you for that. And again, I think it's interesting that there are many points that you bring up that are then echoed in your book, Jeremy, things like culture wars. And I'd be interested in bouncing it to you, asking, one of the things that came across in your book is very much how all of these tensions are by design. The not having the time at the end of the day, the grind culture that begins with the standardized testing, the, you talk about platforms and you know, how everything has become numerical, whether that's your likes on social media, or can you talk a little bit about that design, like how it is that is the system that has been built?
Yeah, well,
I mean, the way we would conceptualize that is not so much in terms of a design or an intention or a plan, but to say that, you know, the general direction of travel of societies like ours since the 70s has been determined by a particular set of interests, and it's the interests of those social groups who've become the most powerful, which sort of, you know, they don't determine everything that happens, but I keep saying, they determine the general direction of travel, and things get kind of pulled in their direction. So, I mean, most of what we describe, I mean, it's probably simplest to understand this if you just think about the power of the financial sector, and across the UK. I mean, it has its sort of centres in places like London and Edinburgh, and I mean, broadly speaking, what you're describing is a culture which is typical of, you know, it's a culture which is typical of the financial sector, but it's a whole kind of way of life and a whole way of living and a sort of mindset which is involves people playing according to a set of rules, according to, you know, which are firstly they're determined by people working in the financial sector, and they are the rules according to which those people can win, you know, are always going to be automatically the winners. So, I mean, education is always a really good example. I mean, you look at the way the kind of pressure. Again, it's more so. I would say it's one of the. I mean, education is one of the areas where there's in Wales especially, actually, to a lesser extent in Scotland, people have been able to sort of put up some kind of bulwarks against this. I mean, in England, it's really been quite savage, the extent to which it's now imposed as completely normative across the education system, the idea that the only function of education is to produce competitors in the labour market. That's the only thing that you're supposed to be doing, really. And schools, universities, teachers at every level have to justify what they're doing according to that rationale and not according to any other rationale, which, you know, as I always point out to people, I mean, that's something that your sort of liberal Tories would have considered sort of shocking and Philistine like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So it's not something that isn't given, it's not natural, and it's something that's happened by virtue of a historical process. But of course, that historical process, what it involved was, firstly, the kind of political and material defeat of progressive forces in the 70s and 80s, and indeed the sort of the engineering of the British economy generally on terms that would make it very difficult for oppositional forces to re-emerge. So, I mean, the number one thing was the destruction of manufacturing industry, and manufacturing industry was destroyed in this country and has been suppressed, like hasn't been allowed to redevelop, because historically the manufacturing sort of section of the capitalist class is always more vulnerable to pressure from workers than any other sections, basically. It's easier to organise workers in industry, and it's easier for organised workers to exercise leverage. So if you have an economy that relies on heavy industry, the historical experiences, you have to make significant concessions to workers, which you don't want to have to do if you're sort of capitalist. So that is, so things have been engineered in that way. The engineering of a sort of precarious labour market in which people don't feel secure, and also one in which has to be, you know, statistically, you know, even people who are relatively secure don't feel secure. Actually, it's one of the features of sort of middle class culture in places like Britain and the States over the past few decades. Is this kind of manic engineering of a sense of insecurity, despite the fact that actually, if you've got inherited asset wealth, there's very little that can happen to you that's going to reduce your class status. So all that is very, very deliberate, because again, the historical experience, especially the historical experience of the post-war period, from the perspective of the capitalist class and its political agents, was, well, if you make things too easy for people, if you give people kind of a functioning welfare system and full employment and expansive public sector, then they don't just sort of gratefully accept it for very long. They just keep making these demands. They keep making demands which sooner or later are going to make it impossible to organise an economy on the basis of profitable accumulation. So you can't do that. Really. You don't want to do that. They don't want to go through the 60s and 70s again. That's the last thing they want. So it's very deliberate from their point of view that they ensure that most people have to work very long hours. Because again, one of the easiest ways to make sure people don't organise themselves politically is to make sure they're too busy working. One way I always put this to students is to say, well, all the historical evidence is, because the question for radicals is often, well, why do people put up with this? We can see how bad it is, and one of our claims in the book actually is contrary to what a lot of theoretical approaches that kind of topic say. We think most people do know how bad it is. We think most people know all this. Like most people basically know we've been screwed over the past few decades, and we sort of took in the 90s and 2000s, we took the deal we were offered, which is we're going to run down democracy, we're going to run down communities, but you're going to get big TVs and cheap holidays. You're going to get all that. We sort of took that, and now that's over, and we're left with nothing, and we've been screwed. I think people sort of know that, and I think people knew for a long time what the costs were, but they didn't really feel able to do anything about it, but. That's the main thing. But also, they've been put in a situation where it's difficult, but it's been difficult, but not impossible, to do the thing which is the major preoccupation of most adult humans for most of their lives, which is feeding their children. And the thing I always say to students is, look, all the historical evidence is, if you make it impossible to people to feed their children, they will revolt. Or they'll usually, unfortunately, they'll usually try fascism before anything else. Mm-hmm. But if you make it too easy for people to feed their children, just the lesson of the post-war period, they will also revolt. They'll stop being willing to accept any level of exploitation or hierarchy, and they will use the free time and resources you've given them to organise themselves. So the thing you have to do, if you're a hegemonic elite, a ruling elite that wants to maintain its position of power, what you want to do is make sure that for most people, feeding your children is possible but difficult. Mm-hmm. And so it's very logical for them to do that, and that is what they've done, and that is what they're sort of continuing to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. You've also answered my next question, so that's handy. I'll skip to the next bit, and then I'll loop back to you. What I wanted to ask in terms of the communities that you're seeing, so in that deliberate individualizing of our world, and this sort of fracturing of society, that you then find people who are desperately seeking to find ways of gluing that back together or resisting that fracturing. Can you tell us about instances that you came across in the research communities that you visited that have effectively found a way of, through community, having time to not work all the hours of the day and night, having time to do whatever else it might be, and therefore break free of a lot of, or some of the constraints that have been put on us? Any examples from the book?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that lots of these communities weren't in opposition to capitalism. Mm-hmm. Lots of them were kind of allied to capitalism, and that's how they worked. They were kind of allied to the market in order to, partner with housing developers and go mainstream. So actually there was some kind of cooperative groups or kind of people who lived in income-scaled kind of rent spaces. But actually, there were also this absolutely fascinating group of digital nomads and crypto investors that lived out the pandemic in the Savoy so they could be one household and not have to isolate. So community is not necessarily always this kind of anti-capitalist thing. In some ways, it was okay, we're all in the tech sector. We can network more effectively and fund each other's projects. The guy, this really amazing digital marketer called Bogdan, was telling me really proudly that $1.2 million in investment had been made between different people in their community. Fantastic. So these communities are gathering points. They're not always in opposition to capitalism. Sometimes it's kind of like, oh, we can get together and do really effective capitalism. But they absolutely were communities that kind of were able to break free from that kind of thing of full-time work. That's what you should be able to do if you're sharing. In some of these aspirational luxury communities, the things they were sharing were like rooftop swimming pools and actually more expensive than living on your own in a flat, because they're kind of like marketing the well-being aspect of community. So there's some really interesting ways of like, what does collectivism mean in those contexts? But definitely in lots of these communities, people were able to not work full-time. I've never met so many people that work part-time and just spent time on the land. So the examples of that happening were mostly in cooperatives, where people either had kind of squatted a house for so long that it was theirs and they just, lived paying the maintenance costs, or there were kind of versions, one that my partner visited in Leeds, Lilac, where you gave a percentage of your income to live there, and that percentage, counted for people that were earning 12 grand and 50 grand. And there were people in that community were able to kind of say, what do I really want to do? Yeah, a really kind of, strange but interesting example. Nobody in the Bruderhof community had any money. Nobody had a bank account. Nobody earned any money. They had a kind of central place of work, and if they wanted everything, they asked the store manager, and that was across, 6,000 people. And they had a massive emphasis on rest. It was really interesting working in their toy factory, because I was there like drilling my wooden toys, like, I'm going to get as many done as possible, and then at the end I'll show them how many I've done in the wooden toy factory. And the guy next to me had really severe physical disabilities and kind of screwed a couple of toys together in the time I'd done 15. And this awful part of me was like, get in. I've done quite a lot more than you. Look, and you think, and it was so interesting because I was saying, some aspects of this factory could be made more efficient. And I found that really challenging, because they would say to me, is that the goal then? And I'd think, oh God, is it? No, you're probably right, it's not. And she said, actually, our greater goal is valuing people. And so ingrained in me is it that I'm like, no, that's a great goal, but I can see some way to streamline that. So it's really interesting, like watching these things in myself as well, about how I'm kind of like, my best self is like, we want to do really equal housing, but I also still want to be a homeowner. We've moved into a commune now where we rent, but I still have our house in case it goes wrong, because selling our house and putting the money into the common pot was a bit too much for risk. So with all of these things, we are tussling with our best and worst selves as well. I come into this from being more fortunate and being a homeowner, and what does that look like to say, okay, I believe in this enough to sacrifice what I have for more precarity? Like, these are things we're still wrestling with. I'd love to tell you that's exactly what we've done, but it's not. It's something we're wrestling with continually. But what they do is give you different frameworks to kind of organise financially where there are different points of access. In lots of these communities, you were able to give in money or give in time or skills. And if you helped more, let's say on the growing project, then that could equate to kind of, contributing less financially. It was a way of kind of saying, actually, we're not really up for a financial system where the way we recognise value is totally in cash. Is that really what we feel, where value lies? No. So let's relook at that in the way we do housing and kind of, reshape it. So absolutely, there were ways of freeing up that time. And particularly when we lived in that community in our 20s, it was the most productive household in terms of being a space of activism than almost any other space I've been in. The kind of food project that Mary mentioned earlier, that came from the kitchen table. We had people living with us who had been street homeless, and we all raided the bins together and put on a meal at the end of the day. There was this kind of frenetic space where in a 3-year period we now have a warehouse which turns over 13 tons a month. runs a catering project, a pay-as-you-feel cafe, a pay-what-you-decide shop. That came because none of us worked full-time. Not any one of us, because my rent was £60 a week, and for that half a bunk bed room, and that could cover the rent for the person coming in. And it meant that it was kind of a mad space where one of our other housemates, she became a candidate to be MP in that time. We all sort of sat on the floor writing her letters. She was the Labour candidate for one of our local areas. It was a really, really productive space. So it's interesting what you were saying, kind of this time-starved thing is part of what keeps us in bad systems, because it takes an enormous amount of effort to change. And that's the other thing. You go to some of these amazing co-ops. I mentioned the Lilac one in Leeds. There's some really interesting ones in Amsterdam, in Germany. They're better out of the UK, I'm sorry to say. And still, even these really amazing projects that sought to challenge financial systems, people with the time capital, the spare social capital, the network capital, the intellectual capital, they were still very middle-class people, because it takes an enormous amount of time and effort to challenge systems. It's amazing that you go to these income scale communities where anyone can access it. Fantastic. You go through the door, who do you meet? 20 people like me who might work part-time, but they've been to university. So there's some really interesting challenges when we look at collectivism, about how do we really, truly, in that, kind of provide challenges to capitalism and alternatives to this kind of competitive self-interest. Because in some ways we're kind of sitting with it as well, and some are kind of allying with it in a really concrete way.
Thank you for that. I think that takes me very nicely to my next question. I'm conscious of time and being able to throw it out to you guys after this one. So put your thinking caps on in the room and online. If I was going to bounce it to you, Jeremy, on the idea of collectivism and the idea of who pitches in when, and in the book when you write about reachability, and that we have organized ourselves very much historically around thinking if we reach those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized, that they'll be the easiest to convince to rise up because they've got the most skin in the game, but actually they are the least equipped to join the fight, and therefore we've kind of got it the wrong way round. Can you tell us a little bit about that and that sort of...
Okay, well, I mean, I feel like I've got to stress when I'm explaining this. This is not a moral argument. This is a purely objective analysis based on historical evidence. And partly it's trying to address a question which we think the book does raise, and which is how do you deal with the paradox in which progressive forces often find themselves? I think to some extent always find themselves, unless you're actually in the middle of a revolution, which is one of the main reasons people won't support you is because they look at you and they don't think you're big enough to win the fight you're getting into. Again, I think this is really important. I think there's a sort of habit of thinking that if people just understood how bad the situation is, then they would do something about it. And I just don't think I think it's just not how it works most of the time. Most of the time, I think, as I keep saying, people do understand how bad the situation is, and to some extent they can see that part of what makes a situation bad is their relative weakness, and the relative weakness of everyone who agrees with them. And the problem you've always got is that this is a kind of circular problem. There's a whole bunch of people you've got to win over who you're not going to win over until you're bigger than you are, until you've got what looks like an impressive enough array of forces and constituencies to have a chance of winning. I mean, let's just say you're talking about an election, for example. Let's just say you're trying to win an election. You're trying to win over floating voters, and the floating voters often won't vote for you unless they think actually not only you're going to win, but having won, the kind of political social movement behind you is powerful enough to be able to implement the reforms you say you're going to implement. And well, so it's a circular problem, though, because you've got to get. How do you get big enough then? Well, the answer then is the logical answer to that is firstly, well, it's always a problem, and and it's a problem which means that most of the time you're going to lose. Just get over that, and it's a problem that every sort of progressive movement has always been faced with, and the only ones that have ever not lost have found some way of getting over it. And the logical way of getting over it is to figure out who is the next easiest group of people you can win over, after the people you've already got. And as you said, I mean, I say this in response to the fact, in my experience historically, I live in London, so most of what I've done for the past few decades has one way or another been grounded there. And I don't know how many times at the beginning of some activist project, some organising project, people have got very excited about the idea that we're going to organise the council estates. And I remember at the start of the sort of Corbyn project, everybody was talking about the Black Panthers and their free breakfast clubs, which was great. But I kept saying to people, look, the Black Panthers was the culmination of like a 120-year process of radicalisation. Like, they didn't start with breakfast clubs. That history started with people like Du Bois, a bunch of black professional class kind of intellectuals, making some inroads into their claims on liberalism. Like, it took 120 years to get to the Black Panthers doing breakfast clubs. You don't start, nobody starts there. And that's a good example, really. That's a good kind of model of what I'm talking about. I mean, the example we give in the book, just as a sort of casual example of the constituencies whom the left should be concerned with mobilising in this country right now. And again, I'm conscious, I'm talking about the education example again, and I'm conscious this is more relevant in England, so I apologise for that. But is school teachers. School teachers in England in particular, historically, by international standards, very poorly organised. They're very easy to reach. They've got high levels of education. It's easy to, but they're very disorganised. They've got a very strong stake in resisting neoliberalism. Nobody becomes a teacher because they want to produce value for the labour market. Nobody does that, and yet they're constantly told that's what you've got to do now. But the level of political consciousness among teachers is pretty low, like apart from union activists. I mean, the average school teacher in England sort of hates the situation, but they have no systematic critique of it because nobody has really given them one. So that's a good example. Whereas conversely, as you put it, I mean, the problem is, the kids on council estates. One of the functions of their oppression is that they don't have the material resources, the organisational resources. They don't have to organise. They're not organisable under current circumstances, sadly. So that's not to say you don't try to work with groups like that. It's not to say that you don't build towards a situation in which they are. But I sort of think it's something quite a lot of people have picked up on from the book because it's something they hadn't thought about before, and it seems like it's a useful idea to think with. But I don't want to sort of make a fetish out of it because I'm not saying don't do political work on the council estate. I'm not saying that, but I am saying, well, the first question when you're trying to build a social and political coalition, it sounds so simple that I feel embarrassed saying it, but the first question is like, who are the people who are closest to you but are not yet part of it? And then how do you reach them? That's the first question. Not who are the people who are over there, who if you reach them, you would be on a pre-revolutionary situation, because we're not in one, sadly. So that's it, basically. That's the argument.
Thank you. I would also there are a few of the ideas that have come up here that have showed up at other events at the Radical Book Fair, including the intertwined picket lines and then Thursday night's mutual aid, which you can go back and watch online if you want to sort of keep delving into those. We have some time for audience questions. Does anyone have a burning question to take? There we go. So we've got one over there and one over here. So I'm going to go one, then the other. Noor's going to go one, then the other. It was just down that end.
Hi, this is quite a complex question. I'll try and keep it as short as possible. But so just to give a quick bit of background, a few years ago, I got involved with Extinction Rebellion. I've been living here for 6 months now, but I was involved in the 2019 protests, and And initially, when I joined that group, I suddenly got very radicalized. I wanted to do something. I cared a lot about the climate environment. And what sold me with Extinction Rebellion, as opposed to other movements before, initially anyway, was they had this idea when we went down to a talk about radical inclusion, and that is what sold me to that movement more than anything else, because they were talking about not just people from different economic backgrounds, but or different racial backgrounds, but also kind of different ideologies, and to the extent where at that particular meeting they had actually somebody from the Brexit Party, which is politically something I find abhorrent, but the fact that somebody was there from that group, I thought was really interesting, and that kind of sold me on that idea, Now since then, I've kind of become more and more distant from Extinction Rebellion and not felt like it's something I want to do anymore. And that's mainly because it doesn't seem like a very grassroots movement. It started off talking about radical inclusion, but that very quickly dropped away from the conversations, and it's lots
I'm
of
going to
really well...
nudge you towards the question.
Yes,
mark
sorry, yeah. But the point... So what I'm passionate about is trying to find kind of groups or movements that talk more about radical inclusion and how we become more unified, and wonder whether you have any advice of where to start with that, because I don't know.
Yeah. Thoughts on groups or organising that builds those bridges or those coalitions? Either one of you want to...
Honestly, I haven't come across groups or communities that I would say they are the blueprint for it. That is where radical inclusion is being done well. That's sad to say. I'm going to use my own project as an example here, which is a bit of a smug thing to do. And that again is this food waste project that we run in County Durham, and that is a place that is a climate project. We don't pitch ourselves as a project that works around food poverty. Food poverty isn't kind of mentioned on any of our kind of paperwork, branding, communication. We are a climate project, and we are interested in how to shine value, the true value, on food, places, and people. Because we have a system that actually treats value in a really weird way. It devalues people, for example, who are disabled or from minority groups. And it wrongly devalues them. Because let's say this food waste organisation, it is lesser for having a really kind of monoculture approach. The more people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different challenges that come in, the better that project is. So one of the things that I find at that project that I wouldn't necessarily find in a campaign group that I've come across, and you might be able to find different ones, is that people are able to come because the terms of engagement are, what do you have that you can contribute? P.S. You do have something. And that is a climate project that does have people from massively different backgrounds. People contribute to that who wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate the problem of climate change, and no one is kind of forced to be able to do that. If you come and you know how to make potato peelings into a pie, then brilliant, those are fantastic terms, in you come. That is an easy in because people come together over food, and what it's doing and its message are all kind of wrapped up together. It's eating, and in eating that food that's been given no value, there is an act of protest, an act of resistance going on through a really practical thing. And so I guess, what does it mean to say this is radically inclusive? It's to say to everybody, you have something to contribute. So I guess reframe how your thing works so that there is a platform for everyone to be able to meaningfully contribute, and not just a nod like, in you come, you're special because you're here, like, fantastic. That's kind of meaningless, and people know that's bullshit if you're being invited in to kind of be a different face in the room and be a kind of, people really feel tokenism very easily. We need to create platforms where people can meaningfully contribute. That is the only way to have true inclusion. That can happen definitely in housing, but yeah, I guess mutual aid and projects where you flatten that structure a bit are the only ones that I've seen, really.
Well, I mean, I think the idea, the XR, that early XR idea of radical inclusion, I think was, to some extent, it was based on a correct intuition, the intuition being that for their project to be successful, it had to be as broad a coalition as possible. I mean, the problem is, and this is a basic axiom of this the conceptual tradition that our book is coming from. The problem is, well, it is true on the one hand that to be successful, you have to make your coalition as broad as possible, but you also have to be able to identify what it is against, and like who is the enemy, like who are the problems you're trying to overcome. I'm afraid, I mean, it's a real problem with the sort of liberal tradition in the Green movement, that it doesn't want to identify an enemy. It wants to just say, well, but this is in everyone's interests. So surely everybody, sooner or later, can be part of this. And it's just not true. There's a bunch of people. There's only a few thousand of them, but they're the most powerful people on the planet. And it is absolutely in their interest as they conceive them, and we're not going to change their minds about how to conceive them, to make human life impossible for the rest of us. They don't. That is what they're going to keep. They are just going to do that. I mean, it's not even people. It's a set of institutions over which nobody really has any control. But you're not going to talk people out of it with sort of moral discourse. It's just not going to happen. And that's always true. And one of the things I always find myself saying in response to this question is, like, there's no theory or philosophical motto which can tell you in advance when your coalition is big enough and at what point you have to draw the limits. All you can know is your coalition does have to be both big enough to win and have some limits. And I would say, for example, I would say the Brexit Party are sort of out with the limits of any kind of progressive coalition. And why? Is because of the question of what are the material interests to which they are aligned. The Brexit Party is clearly aligned to particular sets of material interests, and it's essentially the hedge funds who have wanted, for whom Brexit was a project they pursued for years because they could benefit from it, from the kind of resultant chaos. It was very clear. And of course, I mean, that was the basic. I mean, one of the real flaws with XR's kind of insane sort of theory of change they were developing from is because they didn't have any analysis of interest. They thought they had these examples of people winning political struggles, mostly over civil rights, over sort of civil liberties issues, and in contexts when there weren't like class interests at stake at all. And then they thought they could transfer that to an issue. The issue of climate, and the issue of climate is very different from those sorts of issues because there are profound class interests at stake. There are profound interests over money and profits, and and so I think, I mean, that's what I would have to say to that. Really, I could go on all day about it.
If I will allow myself, I'm not a member of RS21, but in Edinburgh specifically, they are one group that have shown great solidarity across issues, and as a sort of radical socialist organisation, they will show up at the RMT strike with a pride flag, and they will show up at a pride march with a union flag, and they will show up for refugee solidarity rallies outside of Parliament with both flags. And they seem to be in Edinburgh, and of the activists that I know, very good at saying, well, I'm showing up for you. And if you do that over and over again and really mean it, that does then bring people into your fight, because you're building those communities and those connections. We're going to take one last question. There was one here in the front, and then we do have the two of them for a wee while. So if you didn't get a chance to ask a question, you can. Are you running off afterwards, Jeremy?
That's all right.
Are you? Okay, we've got a little bit of time afterwards. So yes, there was a question here.
So I was wondering if actually this question kind of splits off one bit for both of you. So for example, in France, for example, where worker productivity as measured by amount of time spent working to GDP per capita is much higher. So for example, workers in France work less hours for the same output as they do in Britain. So they have more time. And I was wondering, with that time, if you are aware of any sort of cool communities or collectives, and whether they are materially different than they are here in the UK, for example, whether they do things differently because they have more time to do so. And that branches off to Jeremy, another question, which is, despite having more time because they are more productive, which you mentioned at the start that one of the reasons why we lacked organization and political sort of coordination here in the UK was that lack of time working, the grind. There seems to still be an inexorable march towards neoliberalism in France as well. Why would that be?
I actually haven't visited any communities in France. The UK has worse working hours than pretty much the rest of Europe. And there are more successful kind of cooperatives around the rest of Europe. But I actually didn't necessarily find that stemmed primarily from this kind of collectivisms, because of the extra time. The thing I found was that governments were more willing to work with people. So it was really interesting talking to people trying to start a cooperative in London and people trying to start a cooperative in Amsterdam. And the ones in Amsterdam were like, well, the first step was the municipality gave us the land and then loaned us the money to build it. Like, oh, sure. It's like, oh yeah, because the kind of municipality had this piece of land spare, and they just made sure legally that it could never fall into private ownership. It's like, oh, okay, I see why this isn't happening in the UK. Because whenever we have a piece of land, we think, okay, who can we sell it to? Maybe some of our friends. So definitely I did see much more successful and much more normalized, cooperatives. Cooperative housing is very unusual. I think it's 0.6% of the UK housing market, something like 18% of the Swedish housing market. It's in the book, so that might not be accurate. I'm just remembering it from my head. But I'm not sure. Well, legislation feeds into culture, feeds into legislation. So I guess those things work together. But I would say the kind of one of the big reasons, other than time poverty in the UK, that people aren't doing these things is we also don't have necessarily governments and local authorities that are prioritising that either.
Well, I would just have to challenge the terms of your question, that France is on an inexorable march towards neoliberalism. I mean, firstly, the level of neoliberalisation in France compared to the situation in Britain, especially in England, neoliberalism just hasn't happened at all, frankly. There was a move away from the high moment of corporatist, this corporatist mixed economy, but compared to the situation here, it's just barely registerable. And that is because at the moment any French government has threatened to do things that the British government did 30 years ago, the country has become ungovernable. Whether that was because of the Gilets jaunes or whether it was because of the the mass trade union actions in the 90s, the successive French governments have tried and failed to implement sets of quote-unquote reforms, which the British government, which both Labour and Tory governments implemented decades ago, Also, EDF is being renationalised. That's happening. It's not like a proposal. Macron is doing it. That is not the inexorable march of neoliberalism. That is a very. I mean, even Macron has more or less declared that neoliberalism is done. That's as far as it's going. So it's just not true. And so I think it's just not true that France is has been on the sort of same trajectory. I mean, France has like every country in the world, like even sort of Scandinavian countries, everyone has been pulled in a certain direction by the kind of global power of the global kind of neoliberal bloc of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Everybody has, but in France that hasn't gone. That just never went as far as it did here, and it's not going to go. There's no good reason to think it's going to go any further than it has, and I would say partly precisely for those reasons, actually, because like people in France. I mean, partly because the people in France defended they defended free time, and so people do have more time to organise. They defend. I mean, that was one of the France is one of the places where that encroachment of the working week was just legally stopped, by the 35-hour week policy, and the retirement age hasn't gone up nearly as much as it has here. So I would say that the French case sort of proves the point, really, rather than, yeah.
We are out of time. It's always such a treat when you have so much material to cover that you could be here for hours and hours. But to then leave you with just the tip of the iceberg, and the rest of it's in the books, which you can purchase using your tickets. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and will you all join me in saying a very big thank you to Mim and Jeremy for being with us too.